Kansas, August 1874. The corn stalks cut the late summer air like blades, rustling high above her head as Zinnia Hart ran barefoot through the rows, her wedding dress ripped and muddy, her breath catching in her throat. She did not stop until her knees gave out. She dropped to the dirt between the stalks, heart hammering so hard she thought it might tear through her chest. Her veil was gone. Her hands bled from thorns and sharp corn leaves. Her white dress, once sewn with care by her aunt, now hung in strips around her legs. The gold band they had forced onto her finger burned against her skin, and she yanked it off, flinging it into the dry soil. She had run from her own wedding. And not just any wedding, an arrangement sealed by her uncle to settle a debt, gifting her to a man twice her age with a cruel voice and a meaner hand. Zinnia had grown up with the Whispers, orphaned young, too soft for a hard land, but no one had ever asked what she wanted. They only saw a girl to be traded, so she ran. And now, hidden deep in a cornfield miles from Abilene, her chest trembling and her lips dry, she wished more than anything she had somewhere safe to go. But she had no family left, no money, just the will to live free, whatever it cost. The sun lowered behind the stalks and the air turned cool. She tucked herself into the dirt, arms wrapped around her knees, and didn't make a sound, not even when she heard the slow, steady steps of a horse. Merrick Easton had been riding his boundary fence when he caught sight of the torn lace snagged on his fence post, fluttering like a ghost in the wind. He pulled his gelding to a stop, frowning. It wasn't cattle. It wasn't nothing natural. He dismounted and walked along the trail, scanning the ground. He saw Prince barefoot. Small, and then he saw her, tucked between the corn rows like a frightened animal, dress filthy and face pale beneath a streak of dried blood. He did not speak at first. Just crouched down a few feet away, hands loose at his sides, voice calm. "You hurt bad," she flinched, then looked up. Her eyes were wide, dark with fear. "Do not take me back." "I do not even know where back is," he said gently. "I am not here to drag you anywhere." She studied him like she didn't believe that. Merrick took off his hat, set it on the ground. "Name's Merrick Easton. I run cattle just over that ridge." She didn't answer. "You do not have to tell me anything you do not want to," he said after a beat. "But it's getting dark and coyotes come through here at night. I have a dry barn and fresh water. You can ride up front or behind or not ride at all. I will walk the horse if you want, but you cannot stay in this field." She hesitated, then stood slowly, blinking hard. "My name's Zinnia," she whispered. He nodded once. "All right, Zinnia, let's get you safe first. You can decide the rest later." His ranch sat at the edge of the Smoky Hills, past a gully lined with cottonwoods. The main house was simple shingled roof, wooden porch, smoke curling from the hearth, but the barn was tall and clean, with hay stacked in the loft and a corner set with blankets. Zinnia drank from the tin cup he offered, hands shaking. She would not meet his eyes, but she stayed close to the stall post, watching him like she expected him to turn cruel at any moment. Merrick moved slow. He set bread and cheese on a crate, then stepped back. "Eat if you want to. I left water on the bench. I will be in the house if you need anything." She didn't speak as he left, but later, when he came to check the barn before bed, he found the food gone and the corner swept clean where she had curled up. The next morning, she was still there. He brought her breakfast and a thin cotton dress from his sister's old trunk. When she finally stepped out of the barn, cleaned up and wrapped in the borrowed dress, he saw her fully in the sunlight and he couldn't stop looking. She was not delicate the way his neighbors might say. Her face was strong, her brow set with quiet fire. Her hands were scraped, her arms bruised, but she held herself like someone who had decided not to break. He admired that. "Did you ride far?" he asked, keeping his tone easy. "I ran," she said. "From Abilene," he blinked. "That was over 20 miles. Wedding," she added, voice flat. "My uncle sold me off." He didn't ask for details. She didn't owe him those. Instead, he nodded. "You are safe here. No one comes this far unless they are invited." She looked at him then, studying him like she was trying to decide if he meant it. "I can work," she said suddenly. I do not want to be a burden. It is not a charity, he said. You help if you want. But you do not owe me anything for a roof and some bread. The look she gave him was something close to disbelief. Days passed, she stayed. Every morning she helped gather eggs or feed the goats. She swept the porch. She spoke little, but Merrick saw the way her shoulders began to lower, the way her steps grew steadier. One afternoon he found her sitting in the high grass behind the barn, watching the sky with a far-off look. "Zinnia," he said, crouching next to her. "You all right?" She nodded. "I never thought I would feel the wind and not be afraid of it." He sat beside her. "I am glad you are here." She turned her head slowly. "I did not expect anyone to care," she said, voice small. "Not really." He met her eyes. "I do." Her throat bobbed. She looked down at her hands. "Why?" "Because you ran when it would have been easier to give up. Because you are still standing. That kind of courage." He paused, then shook his head. "It matters." She swallowed hard, then reached over and touched his hand. He did not move. But he turned it slowly under hers and wove their fingers together. That night she did not sleep in the barn. He set up the spare room in the house, folding the quilts she picked from the closet. She stood in the doorway, watching him. "Thank you," she said softly. He looked up. "You do not have to thank me, Zinnia." "Yes, I do." He stepped closer. "You are not unwanted. Not here." She looked up at him then, eyes wide and full. Something in her broke open, and she leaned into him, pressing her forehead to his chest. He wrapped his arms around her. And for the first time in her life, she felt safe. The September light came thinner now, gold rather than the heavy brass of August. Zinnia stood beside the garden fence, sleeves rolled, brushing dirt from her palms. A row of late beans had surprised them both, curling up the stakes like they still believed in rain. Merrick had leaned out the door that morning and called it a second-chance harvest, and she'd smiled before she could tuck it away. She didn't smile much, not where anyone could see. But with him, it was getting harder to hold it down. He came around the corner with a length of wood balanced on his shoulder and a bucket of nails in his hand. "You reckon those'll be ready for picking by next week?" Zinnia nodded. "If the frost holds off." "They're stubborn." He set the board down and looked over the fence with quiet approval. "You too." She glanced up, not sure how to answer that. The wind caught her hair and she tucked it behind her ear with a thumb-stained green. "I want to build a drying rack," she said, "for herbs. I know what to gather. I used to do it with Aunt Cora before she passed." Merrick's eyes stayed on her, steady and warm. "You tell me what you need, I'll help you build it." She bent to gather the basket, her voice softer now. "I don't want to just take up space here." "You don't," he said. "You make it feel fuller." Later, on the porch, she laid the beans out on a flour sack to dry, and he brought 2 mugs of coffee, the kind that burned the tongue a little. She took hers and leaned back against the post, not quite touching his shoulder but close enough to feel his presence. "I haven't really known quiet before," she said after a while. "Not the kind that doesn't press down on your chest." He didn't answer right away. The chickens clucked in the distance and a hawk passed overhead. "It's not always peaceful here," he said. "Winter's sharp and drought can be cruel. But the quiet never lies to you. That's something, I think." Zinnia turned her face toward the fields. "I used to lie to myself all the time, told myself it wasn't so bad, that I could manage." "You don't have to anymore," she nodded, absorbing that like sunlight. As dusk rolled in, they sat without speaking, just the creak of the porch boards under their boots and the hush of night setting in. It was the kind of silence that held room for everything unspoken. For the first time, she didn't feel she had to fill it. The next morning, she rose early and crossed the pasture with a lard tin full of bread heels. Merrick's dog followed at her heels, tail wagging low. She liked the dog's company. He didn't expect things from her, just showed up and walked beside her like it was the natural order of things. At the far end of the field, she caught Merrick digging post holes, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. He straightened when he saw her, leaning on the shovel. "You're up early." "I want to check the creek bed," she said. "There's wild mint there if the cattle haven't trampled it out," he nodded. "Take the dog with you and the rifle if you're going that far." "I know how to handle one." "I don't doubt that." She gave him a look, not playful exactly, but something close. You think I'm soft. I think you've been treated rough. That's not the same thing. She studied him, the way his eyes didn't flinch, the way he didn't reach for her or turn away. I'll be back by noon, she said simply. When she returned, her apron was full of mint and narrow leaf plantain. She didn't say much, just tied bundles with twine and hung them from the rafters of the lean-to. Merrick watched from the porch, a faint smile touching his mouth. She moved with purpose, not like someone trying to prove herself, but like someone remembering who she was. That night, while washing up, she found a splinter in her palm. It lodged deep, just under the skin, and she hissed when she touched it. Merrick heard her from the doorway. Let me see. She held it out wordlessly. He sat beside her, drawing the oil lamp closer. His hands were calloused but careful as he worked the sliver free with a clean needle and a strip of cotton. She watched his face more than his hands. When he finished, he wrapped her palm with a strip of torn muslin. You'll be tender for a day or two. I've had worse. I know. She didn't pull her hand away. You treat me like I matter, you do. Her voice barely rose above a breath. That's still new to me. He looked at her then, full and unwavering. It won't stay new forever. She didn't speak, but her fingers shifted in his, curling slightly. He kept holding on. The weather turned overnight. A cold snap pushed down from Nebraska, and by morning, frost clung to the fence rails like silver lace. Zinnia pulled Merrick's old duster around her shoulders before stepping out to the coop. She moved slower now, not from fear, but the steadiness of routine that had begun to root itself in her bones. Merrick was already in the paddock, oiling the hinges on the south gate. He didn't look up when she crossed the yard, but she saw his hand pause at the sound of her steps. There's a patch of buckwheat near the rise, she said, setting the egg basket on the porch. If I get to it before the frost takes it, I can mill it down for poultices. He straightened, wiped his hands on the back of his trousers. You think it'll keep through winter, if I store it right? Dry room, no sunlight. He studied her, head tilted just slightly. You know how to do more than most doctors I've met. I don't patch gunshot wounds, but I can ease a cough and draw out a fever. You ever think on making that your trade? She glanced down at her hands. I never thought on what I wanted, only what came next. Merrick didn't press. He rarely did. But when she turned back toward the porch, she felt his eyes on her, not heavy, just there. That afternoon, they rode out past the ridge. Merrick had offered the mare with the easy gait, and Zinnia took the reins without hesitation. The cottonwoods had begun to yellow, their leaves drifting in slow spirals to the ground. She didn't speak much, but she watched the land like it belonged to her too now. At the crest of the hill, they dismounted and walked the rest. The buckwheat grew in a soft dip between two knolls clinging low to the earth. Zinnia knelt beside it, fingers brushing the tops gently. It's good, she said. Dry but not brittle. Merrick crouched beside her. You want help cutting it? She looked over at him. You willing to get scratched up by stalks for something you'll never use? I don't mind the sting. She handed him her knife, and they worked side by side, slipping the stems into canvas sacks one by one. The sun dipped low, throwing long shadows across the flats. By the time they stood, both their hands were dusted with pollen. You always this quiet when you work? She asked, brushing her skirt off. I talk when there's need. And when there isn't, I listen. She smiled, then not the first time since she'd come, but the first time it lingered. Back at the ranch, Merrick lit the stove while Zinnia sorted the buckwheat into jars. She moved with a kind of reverence, her hands sure and deliberate. He watched her from the doorway, arms crossed. You think you'd stay? He asked, his voice low. She turned, eyes meeting his. I haven't thought that far. I'd like you to. Her breath caught just barely. You wouldn't mind folks talking. They talk no matter what. I care what you think. She set the jar down slowly. I think I stopped believing in a place that didn't expect me to run. You don't have to anymore. Silence settled, softer than before. She stepped toward him, close enough to smell wood smoke on his shirt. You've given me more than a place to stand, she said. You gave me room to be. I want to give you more than that. She looked up at him, the firelight catching the edge of her jaw. What else? Whatever you'd let me. He didn't move to touch her. He just waited. After a long moment, she reached for his hand. It was calloused, warm, familiar. I think I want to stay, she said. He didn't say anything in return. He just laced their fingers together and held on. October came in slow, with wind that smelled like river stones and distant wood smoke. Zinnia stood at the edge of the hog pen, a pail of slop in one hand, watching the sow nudge her piglets from the trough. The animals had started growing their winter coats, and she'd begun lining the coop with straw to keep out the cold. Behind her, Merrick was mending the harness that had cracked during the last haul from town. He sat on the porch steps, one boot braced against the rail, leather stretched across his knee. "You ever thought about keeping bees?" she asked suddenly, not turning. He looked up, threading the awl through a buckle. "Can't say I have. There's wild hives in the cottonwoods. If we set out boxes before spring, we could draw some down. Honey stores well, and the wax could make candles." He nodded once, not quick. "If you're set on it, we'll start building boxes before the snow sticks. I've still got a few beeswax wraps I stitched back in Cora's kitchen." She stepped away from the pen, brushing her hands on her apron. "They hold herbs better than anything else I've tried." Merrick watched her walk toward him. Her hair was braided low today, tied with a strip of cloth the same faded green as the hills behind them. "You always plan this far ahead," I learned to, she said. "When you don't know what's coming, you pay attention to what might." He tapped the heel of his boot against the wood. "You figure you'll be here when the hives fill?" She met his gaze without pause. "I want to be." The wind picked up, carrying dust across the yard. She stepped closer, settling beside him on the top step. He handed her the harness strap and she ran her fingers over the stitching. "You did this by hand," he nodded. "Don't trust the tanners in town with anything that matters." Neither did Cora. She used to say the only thing worse than a careless man was a careless tradesman. She sounds like she was worth listening to. Zinnia didn't answer right away. Her thumb kept tracing the seam. "She kept me alive longer than I would have made it myself." Merrick let the silence sit a moment before he spoke again. "You ever think on what kind of life you'd make if no one else got to decide it for you? I think about it every morning now." And she stood, slow and deliberate. "It looks a lot like this place, but with more jars on the shelf and maybe a red shawl for Sundays." He stood too, brushing dust from his trousers. "I've got lumber for shelves and I know where to find a weaver who trades fair." She tilted her head. "You offering me more than bee boxes? I'm offering you a place to put your future down, if you want it." She stepped close enough the wind didn't get between them. "I don't want to wonder anymore where I belong." "You don't have to." She reached for his collar and kissed him quietly, like she'd meant to do it for weeks, but waited to be certain. His hands found her waist steady, and they stood like that, the porch creaking beneath them, the fields stretching wide and golden past the fence. When she pulled back, she didn't look away. "I want to build a home with you," she said. "You already are," he replied. "One breath at a time." They went inside together, not hurried. The lamp on the table burned low and the windows let in the last of the light. He set a log on the fire while she pulled the kettle off the hook. The room was warm and it smelled of cedar and dried mint. He set 2 bowls on the table and she ladled stew without asking. They sat across from each other, knees brushing beneath the table, and nothing about it felt uncertain. Outside, a coyote called from the ridge and the wind scuffed the shutters. But inside, everything held. And for the first time in either of their lives, the quiet wasn't an absence, it was peace. The first snow came early in November, light as breath at first, then heavier by sundown, layering the roof and paling the fields. Zinnia stood at the window after supper, arms folded, watching the flakes drift past the lamplight. Merrick was behind her, rolling the sleeves of his shirt down, the stove ticking as it cooled. "You think it'll stay till morning?" she asked. He came to stand beside her, the floor creaking under his step. "If the wind holds north, we'll wake up to a white yard." She didn't answer right away. Her eyes were fixed on the dark beyond the glass, thoughtful. I never lived through a winter somewhere I planned to stay. He leaned his shoulder gently against hers. It's different when the roof's your own. She looked up at him then, her expression quiet but sure. I want to put my name to it. Merrick took that in without blinking. You mean the land, I mean the life. The house, the work, the hours between dusk and dawn. He nodded once, slow. Then let's make it a home in both our names. Her throat moved as she swallowed. I don't want to wait till spring. There's no reason to. The next morning they rode into town before the snow thickened, bundled in wool and oilcloth. The courthouse clerk was half frozen and surprised to see them, but Merrick signed the deed amendment with a steady hand, and Zinnia followed with hers, not hesitating. They left with a sealed envelope and no fanfare, but she held it close the whole way home. A week later, the preacher came by on his circuit, and they married in the parlor, with a pot of stew on the stove and the dog curled at their feet. Merrick wore his cleanest shirt, and Zinnia tied her hair with a strip of blue fabric she'd found in a trunk in the attic. There were no guests, but they didn't need them. She said her vows without trembling, and his voice never wavered when he said hers. That night they sat at the kitchen table long after the fire dimmed, hands linked on the worn wood. You nervous? He asked, brushing his thumb over her knuckles. No, she said, not even a little. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead, then her mouth, slow and certain. Her fingers curled into his shirt, and neither of them rushed. They moved through winter together like they'd been born into it. She kept the jars lined and labeled, and he built a second coop before the thaw. When the snow grew too deep for the wagon, they walked the fields on snowshoes Merrick had made years earlier and nearly forgotten. Zinnia learned to mend his gloves with wax thread, and he carved her a frame for drying roots that swung from the rafters like a wind chime. One night, while they shared bread and roasted squash, she looked across the table and said, I want to teach other women what I know. How to keep herbs, how to make what lasts. Merrick put his cup down. You think they'll listen? She nodded. Those that want to stay alive will. I'll build you a shed, he said, with windows. South-facing. By spring, the shed stood behind the main house, its walls lined with shelves and hooks, a long table set beneath the window. Word spread slow but steady. Women from nearby farms came with questions, sometimes bringing their daughters. Zinnia never turned any of them away. She taught them to steep elderberry, to bind a twisted ankle, to read the signs of a hard season before it came. Merrick never hovered, but he kept the path raked and the door hinges oiled. He knew what it had taken for her to find her own place, and he guarded it without ever needing to say so. One evening, as the wind pushed through the wheatgrass and the sun drew long across the ridge, Zinnia came in from the shed with dirt on her hands and a flush in her cheeks. Merrick was at the table, sharpening a drawknife. She stepped behind him and wrapped her arms around his middle. You tired? He asked, setting the tool down. No, she said. I feel like I've just started. He turned and drew her into his lap, arms circling her waist. She rested her head against his shoulder, and they sat that way until the light faded. Later, they lay in bed with the windows open to the warm wind, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing the curve of her back. You ever think on what came before? He asked quietly. She was quiet for a beat. Sometimes. But it doesn't ache like it used to. You ever wish you'd done anything different? No, she said, because it wouldn't have brought me here. He kissed the top of her head. Then we did something right. They fell asleep like that, the night soft around them, the past no longer sharp. Years passed. The shed became a gathering place. Children were born to nearby families, and Zinnia taught their mothers how to ease fevers and keep colic at bay. Merrick built a second barn and took in 2 orphaned colts. In the evenings, they sat on the porch with mugs of chicory and watched the land stretch wide beneath the sky. They never left. They never needed to. And in the house they'd built together, every corner held the shape of their joined lives, sturdy, quiet, and full of the kind of love that asks nothing but to be lived in, every day.